Dear Father in heaven, we pray that you can be with us as we look at Alzheimer's disease, and then later your plan for preventing it and for reversing it. We ask for your presence in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Everyone knows of a cancer survivor, but no one knows of an Alzheimer's survivor. And again, we're summarizing some notes. This introduction is basically from Dr. Bredesen, who has put together a lot of lifestyle approaches which have been used to reverse Alzheimer's. And this is a summary from the notes in his textbook here. The standard approach to Alzheimer's has been to use medicines, drugs, which can reduce the symptoms for a time, but does nothing to reverse or halt the underlying cause of the disease. But now, as quoting from Dr. Bredesen's book, he says, "Let me say this as clearly as I can. Alzheimer's disease can be prevented in many cases. Its associated cognitive decline can be reversed, for that is precisely what my colleagues and I have shown in peer-reviewed studies in leading medical journals, studies that for the first time describe exactly this remarkable result in patients." So what is Alzheimer's? Here's a normal nerve, an artist's conception. In it, you see the nucleus, and then the branches from the nucleus are the axons, which go and communicate to other neurons, and that communication is through electrical signals, and that's how we think, how we remember. In the picture on the left, that would be, on your right, would be the Alzheimer's plaque. See that hazy dots? That's formed and it apparently blocks transmission of the nerve signals along the axons, and that's what causes the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So why is amyloid formed in the first place? We're going to look at that later this afternoon. But what we want to know now is how to recognize Alzheimer's and what it's like to descend into Alzheimer's. This is a case history from Dr. Bredesen's first patient. So what's it like to descend into Alzheimer's? For a long time, we did not know what it was like to descend into Alzheimer's. However, now with patients recovering, we know what it's like to descend into it and to come out of it. So let's meet his first patient. Meet Kristen. Kristen is suicidal. Years before, she had watched in despair as her mother's mind slipped away, forcing her to enter a nursing home after she could no longer recognize family members, let alone care for herself. Kristen had suffered along with her mother, who at age 62 had begun her 18-year decline into Alzheimer's disease. And at the end, Kristen had suffered alone, for her mother was no longer sentient, couldn't communicate with her. When Kristen was 65, she began herself to experience her own cognitive declines. She got lost when driving on the freeway, unable to remember where to get on, when to get off, even on familiar routes. She could no longer analyze data critical to her job or organize or prepare reports in a timely fashion. Unable to recognize or remember numbers, she had to write down even 4 digits, not to mention phone numbers. She had trouble remembering what she had read, and by the time she reached the bottom of the page, she had to start at the top again. Reluctantly, Kristen prepared for her resignation. She began to make mistakes more and more frequently, and often calling her pets by the wrong names, and having to search to find light switches in her own home, even though she had flipped them on and off for years. Like many people, Kristen tried to ignore these symptoms, but they got worse and worse. After 2 years of unremitting cognitive decline, she consulted her physician, who told her she was becoming demented just as her mother had, and there was nothing he could do for her. He wrote memory problems on her chart, and because of that, She was unable to obtain long-term care insurance, something that Alzheimer's patients would definitely need. She underwent retinal scanning, which revealed Alzheimer's-associated amyloid. She thought about the horror of watching her mother decline, about how she would live with progressive dementia and no long-term care, about the lack of treatment. She decided to commit suicide. She called her best friend Barbara, explaining, "I watched what my mother went through as she slipped away, and there's no way I will allow that to happen to me." Barbara was horrified to hear Kristen's saga, but unlike when other friends had fallen victim to dementia, this time Barbara had an idea. She told Kristen about new research she had heard about and suggested that rather than ending her life, Kristen traveled several thousand miles to the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, just north of San Francisco. In 2012, she came to see me. It was Dr. Bredesen. We talked for hours. I could offer no guarantee, no example of any patient who had used the protocol, nothing more than diagrams, theory, data, and from transgenic mice. In reality, Barbara had been premature in sending her to the Institute. And to make matters worse, the protocol I developed had just been turned down for the first proposed clinical trial. The review board felt that it was too complicated and pointed out that such trials were meant to test only a single drug or intervention, not an entire program. So all I could do was go over the various parts of the protocol and recommend that she take these to her physician back home, asking him if he would work with her. She did that, and so became what has become known as the RECODE protocol. 3 months later, Kristen called me at home on a Saturday to say she could not believe the changes in her mental abilities. She was able to work full-time again, to drive without getting lost, and to remember phone numbers without difficulty. She was feeling better than she had for many years. When I put the phone down, what rushed into my mind were decades of research and countless hours at the whiteboard with lab members and colleagues. The arguments with myself and about each detail of the theory and the treatment approach, all of this had not been in vain. It had pointed us in the right direction. Of course, Kristen was only one person, as they say, an N of one, and we needed similar results in thousands and ultimately millions. I thought back to the doctor who told his patient, "You're an anecdote. You're not statistically significant," to which his patient replied, "Well, my family says I'm significant. Besides, I'm healthy once again, so I don't care about statistics." Indeed, every fundamental change needs to start somewhere. Every successful approach must start with patient zero, and Kristen was patient zero. She confided in a family member, "Did you know I had Alzheimer's disease?" He said, "Of course, it was obvious. I just didn't want to say anything to you about it. I did not want to make you feel bad." Kristen, who's now 73, has been on the RECODE for 5 years. She still works full-time, travels the world, and continues to be asymptomatic. Furthermore, she has discontinued the program, albeit briefly, 4 times for various reasons. A brief viral illness, running out of some of her pills, traveling, and each time her cognition began to decline. But when she resumed RECODE, it again returned to normal. By the way, we see this with diabetics, hypertensives, obesity patients. When they stay on the program, they do well. As soon as they get off the program, things start to get worse, and they get back on the program, things again get better. As of August 2017, 200 patients had successfully been treated with for Alzheimer's disease, and Dr. Bredesen has trained about 405 physicians, neuropsychologists, nurses, health coaches, and nutritional therapists from 7 different countries and throughout the U.S. with this approach. So, how does the protocol work? Well, first, what's Alzheimer's look like under the microscope? Alzheimer's brains have 2 abnormalities. The front one is amyloid plaque. It's between the synapses or spaces between neurons. Signals sent from one neuron has to cross the space to get to the other neuron, and that space is called a synapse, and that's where the plaque develops and stops the synapses from functioning, prevents transmission of the nerve impulse. The second abnormality was a profusion of long, stringy proteins called tau. The importance of these was overshadowed by the amyloid plaque. Billions has been spent finding and testing amyloid removing compounds in clinical trials, and none have been safe or effective in halting and reversing the disease process. According to the Alzheimer's Association, no drug, quote, can cure Alzheimer's or stop it from progressing. So, what's the problem? Actually, the problem comes when threats occur to the brain, and the amyloid plaque is actually the body's response to these attacks on the brain. The problem comes when these threats are chronic, multiple, unrelenting, and intense. In this situation, the defenses, the amyloid plaque, that the brain mounts are also chronic, multiple, and unrelenting, and intense, so much so that these protective mechanisms cross the line into causing harm. Specifically, Alzheimer's disease is what happens when the brain tries to protect itself from these metabolic or toxic threats. And the threats are, well, the first one's inflammation. If you have inflammation from an infection, from a poor diet, or other causes, even allergies, gluten sensitivities can cause inflammation. Amyloid plaque can be generated as a defense, as part of this inflammatory response against these allergens. Also, there can be a decline and shortage of supportive nutrients, hormones, and other brain-supporting molecules. These can be thyroid hormones, sexual hormones. They can be lack of nutrients, B12, folate, other vitamins and minerals. And what happens is when you have decrease in the supporting nutrients, the brain starts to downsize. It says, I can't support the whole brain structure, so it starts to downsize, and amyloid plaque is what sends out signals to downsize and start limiting the brain capacity because it can't support a large brain capacity. A third thing is toxins, metals, biotoxins, poisons. They can be produced by microbes, or they can be metals in your water or that are exposed to in your environment. These toxic substances, amyloid plaque can actually bind the toxins and help protect you from their effect. The problem, again, is if you get too much amyloid, it blocks the nerve transmission. In inflammation, they can actually help fight infections, viruses, and bacteria. And then the fourth contributor is diabetes. Insulin resistance is now seen as one of the biggest contributors of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's has been nicknamed diabetes type 3. It's the next form of diabetes or next manifestation of insulin resistance. And so how do we reverse it? Well, the 5 steps in reversing it is first, you've got to diagnose Alzheimer's. In other words, you need to look for the symptoms of Alzheimer's and then suspect it, and then there are tests that can be done to confirm that this is Alzheimer's and not another form of dementia. The second step is then to identify which of those 4 assaults is the main assault in this case of Alzheimer's. And that's usually done with a lab test, with a health coach, someone who can do the lab tests and look at your blood work and help identify, is there inflammation? Is there insulin resistance? Is there lack of trophic or hormones? Or are there toxins present, heavy metals? Then the next step is to remove these disturbances. We have ways of reversing insulin resistance. We had one patient come to us up in Maryland who had Alzheimer's. She would be talking to me in her initial exam, and she would have to stop every few minutes and look for a word. And it was just very difficult for her. And when we did her tests, her main issue was insulin resistance. And when we did a simple change in diet, moving to a plant-based diet, limiting the oils in her diet, her insulin resistance dropped dramatically, And in about even 6 weeks, her mother, she was 60s, her mother lived with them. She said, your mind is clearing. And when she came visited our house, when she was talking, there was no pause in her vocabulary. She wasn't searching for words. And she was recounting a lot of her past history from childhood with no difficulty at all. The diabetic cause is one of the most easily reversible and most quickly reversible. Then once the disturbance is removed, the amyloid can be removed. The body can naturally get rid of it, and then it can rebuild the synapses that the disease has destroyed. So, step 1, diagnosis. What does it look like? What are the symptoms that you would expect? And we're going to look at one person's description of her symptoms, because she is one who went into Alzheimer's and then came out of it. And so we're going to go through her history. And this is, again, from Bredesen's book. This is one of his patients. She had difficulty recognizing faces. This is called facial blindness. She had trouble recognizing people. She had decreasing mental clarity, number 2, later in the day. Helping my kids with homework, she says, felt mentally exhausting. It was similar to the feeling I would get when I was a college and grad student after studying intensively and taking long exams, except that it would happen at 3 in the afternoon without having mentally exerted myself at all. In addition, reading, especially later in the day, became increasingly difficult, and I often had trouble remembering what I read, sometimes even from one page to the next. I would often fall silent in group conversations, especially when they involved more complicated or controversial subjects. I often felt I didn't have anything to add. The ideas just weren't there. Number 3, she had decreasing interest in reading, an inability to follow or engage in complex conversations, an inability to follow movies and complicated plots. She said, conversations became tiresome for me. I didn't know why. I had trouble following some that were not in my field and just wanted to close my eyes. Number 4, she had decreased ability to recall what she had read or heard. It felt exhausting to have to try to remember things, whether it was what to get at the supermarket or what kind of sushi my kids wanted to order. Required course reading seemed very dense, and I had no recall. I also had difficulty remembering other things I had used to read. I had difficulty remembering other things I had read, like novels and magazines. Reading, which I used to crave, was no longer a pleasure. She had decreasing vocabulary. I might say aggressive, but had stopped saying pugnacious or truculent. I don't think I've ever used those words. I would say someone was thinking about something over and over instead of saying that she was perseverating or on something. I would say someone was very social, but I wouldn't say she was gregarious. Along these lines, I would also do word searches when speaking, where I might pause looking for the right word. I'd usually come up with a decent word or find a roundabout way to say something. For example, I would say that someone went about something following step by step like they should, because I couldn't access the word systematic to say a systematic approach. This was disconcerting to me and would take real mental effort, but it was not so obvious to be noticed by others. In other words, because she had workaround ways of saying things, they didn't understand that she couldn't access the more sophisticated words she wanted to. After about 5 or 6 months on the protocol, when I was talking with people, I would notice I would naturally use words that I hadn't used in many years, like those above, and would surprise me. It would surprise me because I had even forgotten they existed. She'd mix up words. It was not unusual for me to mix up my kids' names from time to time, but what started to happen shortly before I made my appointment with the clinic was that I would use words that were completely wrong. For example, while I was taking my kids to school, I would call out to the toll booth operator loudly and confidently, "Conference call," instead of carpool, to get my carpool discount. On another occasion, I called my dog in the yard, yelling Chili, which was what I was making for dinner, instead of Juno, her name. I had decreased processing speed. She both thought more slowly, feeling fuzzy during work meetings, and in particular, and typed more slowly, as if signals from her brain to her fingers had to travel through molasses. Number 9, she had difficulty remembering her to-do list and appointments, often feeling overwhelmed by what needed to get done. Eleanor was starting to miss appointments and was becoming very anxious and stressed at not being able to keep track of everything going on in my life. She said, I used Google Calendars and had reminders everywhere, but was still forgetting things. When I was younger, I used to be so confident in my memory. I never missed appointments and memorized phone numbers the first time I dialed them. She also had trouble with sleep. She said, I would awaken easily, and when I did, I would have great difficulty falling back to sleep. Sometimes it would take hours. I would also awaken many, many times in the night. She used caffeine, and she wasn't getting the mental boost she used to get from caffeine. Don't recommend caffeine, but that was one of the symptoms. Also, 12, she had trouble speaking foreign languages, including Chinese and Russian, that she had once been proficient in. How did she feel? That's what she said. I want to articulate what it felt like to be in a fog of early cognitive decline, something I feel I have a special perspective on because I climbed out of it. I came up with an analogy of feeling you get when you are wearing headphones trying to talk to someone next to you. It sounds muffled and you feel more distant from others. Similarly, before I reversed, it felt like I had a film of gauze over my brain that kept me from really connecting with others and from being able to easily engage in normal conversation back and forths. It was sometimes an enormous effort to formulate my response, such as in work meetings, and then to convey it without forgetting what I wanted to say. It was as if that gauze were a barrier that I had to punch through to get the thought out. Conversation, especially about more sophisticated topics, had become far from the effortless activity that it had been when I was younger. Well, Eleanor began the RECODE protocol early in 2015. Within 6 months, she noticed clear improvements in her cognition. She underwent neuropsychological testing after 9 months, which confirmed her improvement. This is the Minnesota, the MOCA test, the Minnesota Cognitive Assessment Test, which you can do. I don't know if you've seen pictures where they try to draw a clock and put the numbers around and identify animals and everything. It's a simple test, takes about 20 minutes, but it can give you a baseline. You can score it as a baseline, and then you can do the tests 3 months, 6 months later. She underwent neuropsychological testing after 9 months, which confirmed the improvement. Her feeling that she was back to normal was no figment of her imagination or wishful thinking. It was real, it was quantified, and it was objectively measured. What did the reversing of Alzheimer's feel like? Well, I am now significantly better at recognizing people and remembering that I had met them. I noticed this in September when I attended Parents' Day at my kids' school. Usually that day makes me very anxious because I don't remember whom I know, whom I've met, and am just not sure who people are without name tags. This year I recognized all sorts of people, remembered their names and their kids' names, and knew little things about them. Even more, I had the confidence to say their names because I knew that I knew them. The 4 o'clock fatigue, that has gone away. I see now that my father experienced this exact change in his late 40s. He cut his days shorter at the hospital where he worked and zoned out with TV after 3 p.m. every day at home. We thought he was just exhausted from work. Now I know that it was early dementia. You can't see this when you are in it. Reading comprehension and recollection improved. Now when I read something or someone tells me something, I remember a lot of it. A big change for me. Now I can remain engaged and even follow conversations that are not in my field. Vocabulary and word search have improved. I find I am now using more words to describe things. I hadn't realized my vocabulary had become limited and my speech less sophisticated, but it had. I see this now that I am starting to use big words again. I still search for words, but much less often, and now I actually find them. Clarity and thinking speed. I am significantly sharper when helping my kids with essays and homework. I wrote one piece recently, something I hadn't done in many years, with speed and focus, similar to when I was younger. My typing speed is back too. Driving, the anxiety I had with driving is starting to let up. Appointments and to-do lists. I recall appointments better now, and the stress from the constant fear of missing things is abating. It's not perfect, but definitely improved. It takes much less effort to remember something. I no longer ask my kids to leave written messages whenever they ask me to do something for them. Sleep. I did notice an improvement with my sleep when I started taking melatonin and magnesium in the evenings at the outset of the protocol. I found that my first sleep stretch felt deeper and lasted for 3 to 4 hours, longer than it had, and that on some nights my awakenings didn't last as long or happen as often. I do not feel tired all the time anymore, and when I have a decent sleep, I feel great. Caffeine, when she drinks caffeine, she has an alertness again. Again, don't recommend that. Foreign languages, surprisingly, the Chinese and Russian that I had not used in years started streaming back. And at one point, I started writing down each word when it reappeared. One of the things that most strikes me about all this is that I couldn't have told anyone about these things, that these things were a problem last year. I couldn't put it all together. I was functioning on the outside. I just thought things were sometimes fuzzy, but couldn't identify specific problems. The changes come on slowly, so slowly that you don't really notice. And the mental fatigue is so powerful it makes you think you're just exhausted or burned out. Now that I'm improving, I can see the deficits for what they were. I feel like it is an awakening and just hope it lasts. I don't know how to thank you enough. Your protocol has truly changed my life. Okay. So that was her experience, and it's been the experience of many people going through the protocol. And then one last thing I want to share from his account is how to give yourself Alzheimer's. It's easy. And basically, it's the American lifestyle, and he's going to go through it's an example of how to give yourself Alzheimer's, things that we do in everyday life. And as we go through this, see if you can pick out anything that you might be struggling with and realize that, hey, if you overcome this area, you can avoid Alzheimer's. So no one would deliberately put herself in the condition Eleanor endured, yet we do it every single day just by eating the standard American diet and living the standard American life. So, how should we start? Well, if you're like me, this is Dr. Bredesen talking. You often work late and find yourself craving a late night snack, preferably something sugary, making your insulin levels skyrocket right before bed, keeping it high while you're sleeping. Turns out that low insulin levels for 12 hours to 15 hours at night are important for the body's ability to clean up amyloid plaque and restart to get ready for the next day. And when you eat at night, you eliminate that intermittent fasting portion that's very important for brain health. Maybe you get to bed well after midnight and sleep poorly because of sleep apnea, often the result of weight gain. Nonetheless, you rise bright and early, getting just a few hours of sleep, another thing that will stimulate Alzheimer's. Your feet have barely hit the bedroom floor when you feel the stress as you contemplate the day ahead. You grab a typical American breakfast, a sweet roll, donut, large glass of orange juice, a big slug of low-fat milk in your coffee, and thereby get a hefty dose of inflammation triggering dairy. Take another step toward insulin resistance and poke holes in your gastrointestinal lining with the gluten. Gluten sensitivity is another source of inflammation in Alzheimer's. You pop a proton pump inhibitor to prevent gastric reflux, even though by reducing stomach acid, you'll impair your ability to absorb key nutrients, such as zinc, magnesium, and vitamin B12. Again, these are supportive nutrients that are often deficient in Alzheimer's patients and have to be replaced. Then you'll take your statin. These are cholesterol-lowering medications. A great way to lower cholesterol below 150. Turns out that cholesterol is actually needed to keep the nerves healthy. You want a cholesterol that is unoxidized. It's actually the oxidized cholesterol that causes plaque in the arteries. Oxidized cholesterol can be from outside sources. If you take cholesterol and mix it with sugar, the cholesterol can get oxidized more easily. One of the more common foods in America that we eat that has lots of cholesterol and lots of sugar would be, you got it, ice cream. Thank you. Yes. So that's a problem. It turns out that it's the, again, oxidized cholesterol that causes the problem. Unoxidized cholesterol, which our body makes, can be not a problem. And if you have antioxidants in your body from the plant foods we eat, you can even protect the cholesterol you make from becoming oxidized. So you do need some cholesterol, but you don't want oxidized cholesterol. Thereby, you increase the risk of brain atrophy when cholesterol goes too low. Oh, and we'll do all this less than 12 hours after our late night snack, which means our body never gets to induce autophagy and remove accumulating debris like amyloid and various damaging protein debris. Again, they're trying to get a 12-hour stretch from your last meal of the night to the first breakfast the next morning. Should be 12 hours or more to give you that body that low insulin level where it can clean up the brain. Rushing out of doors, our stress level is high, producing cortisol that damages our hippocampal neurons. The hippocampus is the area that controls memory in the brain. In Alzheimer's patients, it shrinks in size. We'll talk about that more this afternoon. So cortisol can damage those neurons. Next, we'll jump in the car, making sure not to get any exercise before work and minimizing sun exposure. We'll talk about exercise. You can actually increase the size of your hippocampus with exercise. We'll talk about a study that actually demonstrated that this afternoon. Also, vitamin D levels are important for, again, preventing and reversing Alzheimer's. So if you minimize your sun exposure, an excellent way to keep your vitamin D levels suboptimal. You know, vitamin D levels have been shown to be more correlated with the amount of sunlight you get than with the supplements you take. I had a physician friend of mine. He thought, well, you know, I think it's all you need is 15, 30 minutes of sunlight a day. He actually timed one day how much sunlight he was getting. He would leave the house in the morning, go from his front door to his garage car, and drive 3 minutes up to a lifestyle center, and he clocked in 3 minutes, and then he left work after dark, came home. He was getting about 3 minutes to 5 minutes a day of sunlight. He didn't realize how little he was actually getting. It may be something, if you have that kind of a schedule, that you have to actually schedule time outside because it may not happen normally. Since we're stressed out and irritable from lack of sleep, we'll keep our interpersonal interactions high-pressured and unpleasant, avoiding positive social interactions and killing joy. When our blood sugar crashes around mid-morning, we'll hit the office pantry. Now, why would sugars crash mid-morning? If you have a high sugary breakfast, your blood sugar will skyrocket up, but your pancreas will respond by releasing a large bolus of insulin, more than normal, or more than optimal. This keeps the blood sugar from going too high, but it overcorrects the blood sugar, and the blood sugar starts plunging down, and about 90 minutes after the sugary breakfast, it will go hypoglycemic. Your blood sugar will get too low. You'll get shaky. You'll want another sugar fix. You go to the pantry, get another sugar fix, blood sugar goes spiking up and come crashing down. And I know in college I was doing this about every 2 hours. I wondered, how come I can't get through breakfast to lunch without more snacks. And when I got rid of the high sugary foods and switched to things like a legume, beans, peas, or lentils in the morning, that gives a slow release of sugar over 5 or 6 hours. You won't get hungry till 2 in the afternoon. Something to try. Anyway, that can also help with preventing Alzheimer's, again, avoiding those sugar crashes. When our blood sugar crashes around mid-morning, we'll hit the office pantry where a thoughtful colleague has left a box of chocolate chip muffins for everyone to partake of. Then lunch, there's no time for anything but a sandwich from the cafeteria or deli. White bread, spongy saline-injected turkey with hormones and full of antibiotics and stress factors. Yum. Alternatively, how about some mercury-laden tuna? Again, heavy metal toxins are another source of assaults which can lead to Alzheimer's. Salad doesn't look good anyway. Wash it down with diet soda and damage our microbiome. Now let's go for brownies so we can get our trans fats and minimize our healthful omega-3 fats. At this point, we've done a yeoman's job of setting our physiological course for Alzheimer's disease. But if we want to get there even faster, we top it off with a cigarette, decreasing the delivery of oxygen to our tissues. That would include brain tissue and sending hundreds of toxic chemicals into our bloodstream. No need to brush our teeth or floss. Who cares that poor oral hygiene promotes systemic inflammation and destroys barriers that otherwise keep bacteria like Pseudomonas gingivalis out of the brain. Again, chronic inflammations in the mouth can be another source of chronic inflammation. If you have chronic inflammation, this can be picked up on a blood test. And so blood tests are helpful in sorting out what would be causing the assaults. Our postprandial torpor sends us to the candy machine. And hey, we've worked hard. We deserve a treat. So to that luscious Frappuccino we've been keeping in the fridge, sugar and fat runs have been our only exercise today and every day. But who has time to get up and move around frequently? Finally, it's time to hit the freeway, heading home, while screaming at the guy in front of us, riding his brakes, thus keeping our blood pressure up and making our blood-brain barrier as porous as a colander that we plan to use for tonight's gluten-filled pasta dinner. On second thought, let's get something from the drive-thru. Large fries, a perfect source of Alzheimer's-inducing glycation and end products, trans fats, and starchy insulin. And we're going to look at another study tonight that shows progression to Alzheimer's for saturated fats and trans fats. And those come from the animal fats and also from fast food places where fats are fried and heated up. So start with large fries, a perfect source of Alzheimer's-inducing advanced glycation end products, trans fats, starchy insulin, oxidized reheated oils, and little vitamin E and neurotoxic acrylamides. You can almost picture a little fry with tiny little boxing gloves snarling, "Let me at that hippocampus." Add the burger from corn, high in inflammatory omega-6 fats and low in anti-inflammatory omega-3s. Slattered with high fructose corn syrupy ketchup on a baked bun, so packed with gluten that it's a perfect way to punch holes in your intestinal lining and in your blood-brain barrier. Home again. Ignore the moldy smell. Mold also can produce toxins, and those toxins can cause inflammation, leading to Alzheimer's. Collapse in front of your favorite screen for some Netflix binging or other favorite fare, as long as it doesn't offer mental or physical stimulation. Actually, learning something new can help stave off Alzheimer's as well. There have been reports of people actually learning the violin when they're 80, and this has helped postpone Alzheimer's. So even though you may be elderly, you're not too old to learn something new. Challenge yourself. Then we can top off the perfect Alzheimer-inducing day with relaxing margarita or 3 to accompany the amaretto cheesecake, and then dutifully pretend to get caught up on work before drifting off to sleep with the lights on and the electronics still blaring. Rise the next morning and repeat. So again, this is I hope you're not doing all of these things, but even some of the things listed here can move you towards Alzheimer's. The good news is that it takes many years for these metabolic brain assaults from the American diet to produce havoc and symptoms. Now, the bad news is the more similar your life is to that which is just described, the more certain you are already impairing your mental sharpness by causing more threats. And again, those threats include inflammation, a shortage of brain-supporting molecules, exposure to toxic substances, and insulin resistance or pre-diabetes. Now, most of the protocol for avoiding Alzheimer's or reversing it, you can do on your own. They're listed in his book. I'd recommend, if you're concerned about it, it's an excellent source for looking at simple things you can do to avoid Alzheimer's. However, for identifying which of those 4 assaults maybe is your particular or your friend's particular cause, it's helpful to get a lab test, a blood test, and go through all the causes. The tests that are done are very extensive. We have through LabCorp, one patient to do the complete test, it costs $1,600 just to pay for all the labs. And those are large, extensive labs. And that's with a discounted rate through LabCorp. You can get an abbreviated lab through Bredeson's online site. If you just go to his website, you can actually sign up and get the blood test for about $1,400, but it's a more limited bank. And you can also find people that would help you implement this protocol on that website as well. Or simply, get the book and follow the programs. Yes, question?
You keep mentioning a book. What book?
It's called The End of Alzheimer's, this one here. It's by Dale Bredesen. And you get it on Amazon. And you can also get it on an ebook. You can just download it on Kindle. So the lab tests, again, you'd probably need to work with your physician to get those. However, the simple things, the general things that work for all of those, we'll be talking about this afternoon. We'll go over some of the studies that show the effectiveness of some simple things: sleep, diet, exercise, brain training, and we'll be looking at some of those. So that's it for now. That's the introduction. Any questions or any comments? Okay. Yes?
What's the blood test to check for inflammation, chronic inflammation?
Chronic inflammation? Yeah, the test is a CRP, C-reactive protein, abbreviated CRP. It's a standard LabCorp test for blood. It's not expensive. I think it's $15, $20 maybe. It will change very quickly. In the hospital, we used to have to look for, if someone's getting better from pneumonia, we'd have to look for the white count to drop. The white count, the number of white cells in the blood would increase dramatically when you're fighting an infection, but it would take many days for those to come down. But the CRP comes down very quickly. It goes up very quickly. So it's a good marker for general inflammation. Yes?
My mom's been diagnosed with dementia.
Uh-huh.
And the doctor said that she's 93 years old.
Oh.
And he said 2 years would be the most that we could keep her in the home because of the nature of the disease. Now, is that run straight into Alzheimer's?
The simplest thing would actually be to have her see a neurologist, because they can do MRIs. They can look for the size of the hippocampus and if it's shrinking. They can do also PET scans. And it would be helpful to get a firm diagnosis of Alzheimer's. There are other forms of dementia, multi-infarct dementia, people having little mini strokes throughout the brain that can cause dementia. And that would be, I mean, lifestyle would help with that as well, but it would be a different approach. So that'd probably be the first step there. Yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am.
Essentially, what is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? Because I hear those names a lot, but how do you distinguish what makes them
dementia is a decline in cognitive ability, the ability to think. It can have many causes. Alzheimer is one cause. Many infarctions is another cause, and so there are different causes. So dementia is sort of the end result. And so you would want to, if someone has difficulty remembering or cognating, you would want to figure out which of those causes, what is causing the dementia. Does that make sense? Or
I'm trying.
Okay. Dementia is, I can't remember and I can't think. So what's causing it? Well, it could be from a lot of small strokes, or it could be from this plaque, this amyloid plaque in my synapses, and that's Alzheimer's. So we need to figure out what's causing it, that's all.
So Alzheimer's can bring on dementia.
Yes, it brings on dementia, that's it. Okay. Any other questions? Or yeah.
Since vitamin D, you can get it from the sun.
Yeah.
Someone cannot be exposed to the sun because of meds. For instance, maybe they have cancer or whatnot.
Sure.
And they're taking maybe octreotide. How can the person get vitamin D more effectively other than just taking the supplement?
I would take it in a supplement. I really don't know how. And it's not. They've got it in foods, but that's essentially a supplement as well. I mean, the safest, simplest way would be to take it as a supplement. Again, it's normally made from cholesterol in the skin. Sun hits it and it forms vitamin D. It also, and cholesterol also is, sunlight actually helps it to be transformed, cholesterol to be transformed into testosterone, male sex hormone, and levels can go up with sunlight. In fact, the Greeks used sun exposure to increase their testosterone levels. They used to, the athletes would used to exercise on the beach naked because the sun would hit the sand and reflect up and they'd get lots of vitamin D. Now, we don't recommend that here, but it was effective in increasing testosterone levels. So vitamin D and sex hormones go up. I don't know any other way. Sorry. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, how many of the symptoms does one have to have in order to be concerned that you might have Alzheimer's?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, she's wondering how many symptoms you have to have before you're concerned that you might have Alzheimer's. One of the problems with Alzheimer's is the person that has it usually isn't too concerned about it. If you are concerned about it, it may be from some other cause generally. Boy, I would probably get his book and go down the list. I listed them up here, but there were 12 different symptoms, and it's a lot to remember. But if you can go down and see, how many are bothering you, that might be a motivation to see somebody or get tested. The other thing is to If you're having difficulty functioning, quite honestly, the sooner you catch it, the more reversible it is. In other words, if you wait till you can't function anymore in society, it's more difficult to reverse it. I guess what I'd recommend would be this afternoon we're going to be talking about some simple general things that you can do, and those are things that you can do even if you don't have Alzheimer's, and it maybe stave off the development of symptoms. If you were to see a neurologist, one of the simplest tests they can do is just this Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test. Again, it's a 20-minute test, and they can score you on it. And if your score, is below a certain value, then you've got, they call it mild cognitive decline. It's sort of a pre-dementia state, and then if the score is even lower, then it gets dementia. And that would probably be a simple thing. I don't know what the neurologist would charge. I'm sorry. Yeah, that was a good question. Yes, sir.
Are the cases increasing of Alzheimer's? I mean, is it?
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
Like a percentage of population or anything?
I don't have the statistics, but it is skyrocketing. I mean, when I came out of medical school, it was just unheard of, or you just never heard about it. And now everybody is getting it. It's like diabetes or hypertension, and the most common one, I believe, is from diabetes. And because diabetes is skyrocketing, we are seeing Alzheimer's just skyrocketing. So, yes?
From about what age does Alzheimer's start?
40s or 50s. Yeah, it can be that young. There is a ApoE4 gene type that increases your risk and can make it occur earlier. And that's a gene that can be tested for in the lab test. It's a blood test. And then the risk increases as you get on further. Yes, ma'am.
I went to a meeting because I was a caregiver for my mom with the Alzheimer's Association, and they had a figure of 5 million people with it.
Okay.
They said that the youngest person that they had tracked was 29 years old,
Oh, interesting.
which
Yeah.
I thought was kind of interesting because I always assumed it was an age-related, and they said that not necessarily so. This particular case is not a...
Yeah, no, it's not, well, I don't know. 40s is generally where they see most of them, but yeah, it's not going to exclude younger onsets. I mean, you can get it earlier. She's wondering, she mentioned that they had a case, the Alzheimer's Association, of someone getting it at 29. So, I mean, it can. When you say when do most people get it, would be later on, 40s, but it doesn't preclude people getting it earlier. So, certainly.
That was rare. They said that was rare.
Yeah, that was rare. But it can happen. Yes? Oh, did you have a question?
Oh, okay. Because you're getting older, does that mean you have to have Alzheimer's?
No,
Okay.
you don't have to have Alzheimer's. No, it's kind of like hypertension for many years, because everybody in America, as we got older, blood pressures rose. And they used to think it was part of aging until they found countries like villages in China and villages in Africa where they're on vegetarian diets, blood pressure does not get higher with age. So in America, it's not so much getting old that causes hypertension, it's the length of time you're on the American diet. And the older you are, the longer you've been on the American diet, the more prevalence you have of hypertension. And I would suspect it's the same for Alzheimer's. So if you have a healthy lifestyle, you can avoid Alzheimer's. For instance, the ApoE4 gene increases your risk dramatically of getting Alzheimer's, but you can cut that risk down to only 20% of the normal risk by proper lifestyle choices. So just because you have the ApoE4 gene doesn't mean you're doomed to get Alzheimer's. There are things you can do to prevent it. So we'll be doing that this afternoon. So. Yes, sir.
What are some meds that can induce Alzheimer's?
Medications that can induce it. The statin drugs are one that we try to help people get off of, just because it's suspected it causes cholesterol to go too low, and cholesterol is needed to help rebuild the brain. Beta blockers, I think there's a suspicion that that can contribute to it, at least the symptoms. That's a good question. Maybe I can get more this afternoon for you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Emerson, I heard a statistic a few years ago that up to 8 to 10% of Alzheimer cases are actually misdiagnosed mad cow disease cases. Is there any truth to
that could be. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. Alzheimer's is kind of tough to diagnose, especially, and it can end up being kind of a catch-all, for whatever dementia. Since Alzheimer's is common, it's easy just to call it that. Mad cow disease, that used to be diagnosed on autopsy. You'd have to take a piece of brain out and look for the prions. I'm not sure, I'm not up to date on the current ways of diagnosing that, though. So, no, good question. Yep. Yes, ma'am?
You were talking about vitamin supplements.
Yes.
I had someone that I met that was saying that when they were dealing with waste, human waste, they found a lot of vitamins floating in the water. So
Yeah.
should you do liquid versus capsule or
Yeah.
because it's like they're saying you're wasting your money with supplements.
Yeah. There's only a few supplements that I'd recommend. For vegetarians, B12 is a good one to use. And then if you're in the northern climates, you don't get enough sunlight, vitamin D. But supplements in general are kind of a two-edged sword. For instance, beta-carotene, they have noted that in countries that eat of lots of the orange vegetables that have beta-carotene in it, they had a very much lower rate of cancer. And they assumed it was because of the beta-carotene in the vegetables. So a food supplement manufacturer said, let's make beta-carotene and we'll sell it to smokers to decrease their risk of cancer. And that's an interesting approach. But the FDA said, well, if you're going to market it that way, you have to demonstrate that it really does decrease the risk of cancer. So there were 2 10-year trials. And one trial had to be stopped after 8 years because the people that were getting the beta-carotene were getting more cancers than the people that were getting the placebo. And then the other study, they had to stop after 4 years because they showed the same response. And the problem is that beta-carotene doesn't work by itself. It works like in an orchestra. It works with flavonoids. It works with things that increase its effectiveness. And so getting beta-carotene from a supplement versus getting it from a carrot is very different. And so I would encourage people to get the fruits and vegetables. The problem is that in America, we would prefer to take a pill and then eat what we want. and because the pills are easier, but it's not the same. I was a lifestyle center I had worked at. We used a lot of supplements for cancer treatments, and I didn't see the response that I saw when we stopped using the supplements and just did the juicing and other sources. Vitamin E is another problem supplement. Vitamin E is an antioxidant. It's very helpful, but we'll talk about it this afternoon. It turns out there's 8 different vitamin E types, alpha, beta, delta, gamma, And you need the whole range of 8 to be effective. Well, you can call your supplement vitamin E if you have just one of those 8. And if you have one of those 8 and you take it as a supplement, it'll suppress the absorption of the other 7. And so when they did the Alzheimer's study, they found that when you got vitamin E from the plant sources, you had decrease in Alzheimer's. If you got it from the supplements, there was no benefit to it. So yeah, it's a good question. And also, it's estimated that one tomato has 10,000 phytochemicals in it, and there's no way that we could make a supplement that would equal even one tomato. When I like to play trumpet, and sometimes they give me first trumpet or second trumpet or third trumpet. If I get a third trumpet part and I go home and I play it, it sounds horrible because it's not the melody line. But when I come back and play it with the orchestra, it sounds wonderful. And that's true for many of the vitamins and supplements. When they're in the plant, they work better. You had a question over here?
Yeah, going through like everyday activities, like allowing yourself to be stressed out and allowing yourself to be overwhelmed, can that trigger Alzheimer's?
If you're too busy?
Yeah, like allowing yourself to be stressed, dealing with like...
Yeah, stress increases your cortisol levels and can move you toward Alzheimer's. So you had a question?
If someone had financial troubles, what about the supplement them versus being able to get the like plant-based, the plants and the fruits and vegetables?
Actually, the fruits and vegetables are probably cheaper than the supplements. I mean, we've had people spend hundreds of dollars every month on supplements. Like the only ones that I would recommend would be the B12 and the vitamin Ds. They actually did a study at one lifestyle center. The students, they checked them for B12 deficiency, and they'd been vegetarians over 3 years, and about half of them were deficient in the B12. So that's about it. Well, thank you for coming. We'll be back with you this afternoon, and if you have more questions, we can probably address them then. So thanks for coming.